tell me who that riding. John the Revelator, tell me who that riding. John the Revelator, tell me who that riding. John the Revelator wrote the book of the seven seals. Who that riding? John the Revelator. Who that riding? John the Revelator. Tell me who's that riding? John the Revelator wrote the book of the seven seals. You know, God walked down in the cool of the day, called Adam by his name. He refused to answer because he's naked and ashamed. So tell me who that riding? John the Revelator. Tell me who's that riding? John the Revelator. Tell me who's that riding? John the Revelator wrote the book of the seven seals. Howdy, folks. We're back. We're back with Book 5, Part 5 of Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin's The Rise of Global Capitalism. This section called Rule of Global Capitalism. We're talking now about the moments, the decades, the crucial last decades of the 20th century when capitalism became instantiated as a global system beyond the American role in it, because you have the system as it's being set up in the post-war world is headquartered in America and is in many ways imposed directly by America. But in these decades, U.S. capital is able to use its leverage against other capital formations and nation states to dictate the terms by which international trade and law are going to operate in a way that is fully American. And that leads to the situation we're in now, where the American role in global capitalism is now fundamentally in conflict with global capitalism's greater urge, movement towards the deterritorialization. Because America really has, at this point, much like capitalism, outweighed its usefulness within the system. But there's nothing else. There's nowhere else for that power to go. So even though like the American state is the thing all this other stuff rests on, and yet our political class is in the process of destroying itself and destroying the legitimacy of the system that props the whole thing up. And that's only possible because we cannot assimilate democratically our decline and our loss of position in global capitalism, because we never spoke it. It was always a secret. It was always being sublimated into other conversations and other politics. And now we can't face it. It's literally impossible. So this first, chapter 9 is called Rule of Law Governing Globalization. But before we get into it, I have to do another little digression to begin with here, because somebody DM'd me and asked me to go into Keynesianism more, because we talk a lot about how Keynesianism is enthroned as sort of the theory that dominates like the economic thinking of the imperial managers of America in the post-war era, and that Keynesianism comes into terminal crisis in the 70s, leading towards neoliberalism after it sort of exhausts itself as a governing ideology. And the question this person had is to what degree is it true that Keynesianism came to a point where it could no longer be applied, or did other factors cause people to just lose faith in the Keynesian solutions that they could have pursued? And I would say that at the end of the day, it's meaningless distinction, because what doomed Keynesianism was the fact that it supposed as its basis the notion that there is an overriding interest that can be discovered through democratic deliberative governance that can, at every point, dictate terms, essentially, dictate conditions under which capitalism will operate. And that is, why guys like Keynes could imagine, why good liberals could oversee capitalism while knowing that it was, at that point, knowing that it had failed, because they all lived through the Great Depression, but thinking that they were putting capitalism on a path to extinction. Keynes used to talk about the euthanization of the rentier class. He basically said, we have to do what the Soviets are demanding, get rid of class rule. It has to. They're a barnacle, they're a parasite, they will destroy the whole system. But the communists say you got to line them up and shoot them. No. We can use reform to control the economy, build institutions of real democracy that can essentially buy out the ruling class so that they can keep their relative positions of wealth maybe in the short term, but they have given up the ability to pass on their wealth generationally and dynastically. And that power and wealth is then socialized. That's the dream. Of Keynesianism. And the problem is that that was a false and incorrect and intentionally delusional read of the situation. What made Keynesianism work when it did, look, we don't have to worry about boom and bust. We don't have to worry about the destabilizing effects of cyclical downturns like the neoclassicals, the Hayekans insist we have to. We can stop that from happening completely by moving the toggles, keeping us in the straight and narrow between inflation and unemployment. We can fill the bucket with federal spending, demand side stimulus that will keep us on an even keel. And by being in an even keel, you legitimize institutions of democracy, and they expand, and therefore democratic control of the economy increases. But what actually happened is that democratic control of the economy during the period of Keynesian supremacy was dissolved. We've talked about it a million times, starting with Henry Wallace being replaced on the ticket in 44, to the Republican wave election of 48, and Taft-Hartley, the Red Scare. We talked about all this stuff, and that's the stick. The carrot, of course, being mass home ownership for white workers. That success, capitalism's success at essentially suborning the state to operate it for it, to legitimize its own institutions, its own interests, like a fucking parasitic larva eating out the insides of an animal without it even knowing it. So when the crisis came, Keynesianism was at a loss, not necessarily because there wasn't a theoretical thing that Keynesianism could have suggested, but because the constituency for any values beyond profit were totally obliterated, because at the end of the day, the whip hand is with the profit motive. Everything else is subsidiary to that under capitalism, regardless of the institutions that are governed and that govern capitalism. In crisis, profit motive becomes the only thing that is protected, because it's the only thing that is actually unifying everybody in power. Everybody is aligned along a profit motive, whereas people are discreetly bunched together along ideological and empirical questions. They're all polarized like fucking iron filings around capital, whether they're in government or whether they're in the private, quote-unquote, private sector, which is, of course, just the same thing from an institutional, structural perspective. We just create these veils of separation and then perform them, and everyone just believes it because there's no alternative. What the fuck is water? And so that meant that when a crisis comes, there is nobody there to speak for a Keynesian solution, because at the end of the day, the system is not governed by a disinterested notion of the greater good. People within government might imagine themselves to be operating off of those assumptions, and they might do their best to uphold them. but their effort is only resonated with the effort of those who are just looking to make money. So that is the failure of Keynesianism, and that is why the MMT thing kind of annoys me, because they're insisting, look, we've proven here that money isn't real. And it's like, well, no shit. What does that help us? You're explaining how the system actually operates without the mystificating mirrors, but getting people to believe a certain thing is true like that does not make them act. And action is what is necessary now. Because the MMT fantasy is that if you get enough people to believe that this is how it works, then that will make them act in a way that re-democratizes our institutions. But that's going to require work at a much more confrontational level, a more grassroots level than at the airy abstractions of monetary theory. And so yes, like Keynesianism was also correct in a narrower sense, but the thing that makes Keynesianism fail inherently is because embedded in Keynesianism is the same theological belief that undergirds classical liberalism, which is that class rule is an inevitable and natural component of life, not hierarchy in some generic sense, the way that guys like Jordan Peterson bring it, like, differences in abilities or skills, distributed through a population. No. A rule by class, as in people with a specific relationship to production, nothing having to do with their intrinsic values or abilities. Their position relative to capital is what determines their ascension. And what the entire liberal tradition accepts and embeds in itself is a secularization of the theory of original sin that permeated Christianity, which was used to prop up feudalism. We cannot socially sustain a belief in a risen, living God anymore, but we can still believe that the natural world is outside of us and it is governed by rules that we can only obey. And one of those rules, according to the high priests of capitalism since the 1900s, has been that class rule is inherent and inevitable. And in fact, necessary. Because first you had like liberal orthodoxy, post-Protestantism, post-Puritanism in England saying, here's predestination in practice. The market is God. What its dictates is God's will. We must submit ourselves to it, which is why they took the gold standard as their religious, sigil. Gold had a abstract, natural value that was outside of human values and human measurements, and that is, of course, not true. That is that is a religious belief, and it's nested on top of the religious belief that class is inevitable, because these religious traditions exist in a context of domination, are reproduced by systems of domination. So the people who live within them and then benefit from them, of course, are going to accept those theological conceptions. Marx comes along and says, actually, no, that's all fake. Humans are in charge of everything. What are you fucking talking about? There's no natural, are you insane? We make values. So that means that rock is not what's going to determine how much money there is. We determine how much money there is. Only right now, the we is the ruling class, is the capitalist class. It could be that we could be us, all of us, led by the working class. And then we can socially determine where the fucking money goes and what value is and what to pursue. And that's the radical, that's the radical, like, Anabaptist Christian tradition that got suppressed by mainstream Christianity. The one that says, actually, we're all saved. There is no original sin. We don't need Christ in the form of the market to determine our worth. We can all live in heaven here on earth. And I believe that if you don't have a utopian horizon like that in your politics somewhere, it doesn't have to actually like come into practical consideration ever. You never have to argue anybody with it because it doesn't matter. It's just part of your identity. Without that, you will eventually drift towards some flavor of authoritarian genocidal fascism, brutality over social civilization, because if you accept class rule is inevitable, therefore the capitalist market is God, then if we are being destroyed by the market, as we cannot argue is not happening now, no one can argue that's not happening no matter what they say, well then we had it coming essentially. And the question only becomes who will suffer first and who will be saved and who will be protected. And that is always going to come down to some sort of Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. And that's everybody's politics. At the if they do not have a belief that there is a human ability to control our destiny. Now, the thing about that gold standard mysticism of the 19th century is that eventually it was no longer sustainable. Because during the 19th century, you saw what it led to. Cyclical collapses, which the Austrians called the real business cycle. And that was no longer sustainable once the economies got big enough and the working class got organized enough, used all of the technology and social relationships developed by capitalism to challenge it. Oh, we can't just let the economy collapse every 20 years and then tell everybody tough shit. We didn't find enough gold rocks to fucking to prevent anyone from starving. It's like you can tell people that when they're a scattered bunch of yeomen and recent immigrants, but once you have like a coordinated working class movement with organs of power like labor unions and political parties, oh shit. And the ability to fucking pull a trigger finger and wield a gun. All of a sudden, you got to do something. You have to do something. And out of that necessity to find a new modus vivendi for like the theology of capitalism, you get Keynes, who says, okay, actually, it's not a sin to determine the money supply. We can determine the money supply. But when we say we, it has to be central banks. It has to be a capitalist class because they're the only ones who have the sufficient information to make decisions of this kind of magnitude. And of course, that assumption rests on the perpetuation of class rule. Like that's the thing. Like all the things that make this all sadly inevitable are the assumed transcendence of these things that we can't even conceive of getting rid of. And so you get central bank independence, and you get this new dual mechanism of pressing the interest rate button up and down, determining money supply, and basically keeping a steady flow of capital that creates consistent over time, stable conditions of growth, not the wild cycles that had predominated before, which is going to prevent the very revolutionary situation that they're all terrified of. But again, it was all premised on colonial super profits and America being the consumer and producer of first result, or of first and last resort. And when that relationship changes, it had to accommodate the reality of other capitalist economies coming into their own as spokes and nodes in the system. It wildly destabilized the situation. And the only way to prevent the reforms that would have had to have happened along the Keynesian road towards euthanization of the rentier class, as they imagined, would have meant direct conflict with capitalism and its manifestation in state power. There were no horses for that by that point. The horses had left the stable because of Keynesianism's very success. Now, you've got plenty of people in America who come from, the populist tradition without a rooting in materialism, who really do believe like absolute fairy stories about America as like a transcendent concept. Do not understand that like even if these things have meaning, it's all socially constructed. They do believe in like a transcendent American value, and the Constitution is having transcendent American values. And that's the kind of like reactionary populism that emerges when you don't have a well organized working class. And there's plenty of these people who want to end the Fed and go back to the gold standard because they've seen what financialization of the economy has done in the last 30 years. They're horrified by it, rightly. But they also share the same underlying premise as the liberals, which is that a class rule is inevitable and in fact preferable and necessary. But because they're not aware of the way these systems depend on each other, they have a fantasy that is just allowed to persist because it's politically useful to people who will get these idiots to vote for Republicans. That they could fantasize one day we're going to end the Fed and get rid of central banking, even though everything that you claim to love about capitalism depends on it. But then the liberals are left sputtering and gawking and not knowing what to do either until they all decided, all right, well, you know what? There's nowhere to go. Capitalism is the real God. We can only serve it. And meanwhile, the actual regulators and central bankers, they have no ideology. Even though a bunch of them are like Ayn Rand aficionados and like supposedly hardcore libertarians and Friedmanites like Alan Greenspan, they take for granted that the state will be intervening in the economy. That's the only way to make neoliberalism work. You can't have a financialized speculative economy unless you have guarantees of state intervention to prop up industries and pump in liquidity when there's a crisis. In fact, what this chapter is about, Chapter 9, Rule of Law Governing Globalization, is the process whereby the U.S. regulatory state went from trying to prevent crises from occurring in the Keynesian sense, intervening to stop an overheating of the market. Now the market depends on overheating. That's the only way that it's like, it's an engine that's really low on gas. It's literally running on fumes. These bubbles are the only thing that will keep it moving forward because its engine has been removed. So that means now you can't prevent crises. The role of the state is to intervene afterwards in crises. And of course, that gives, in those crises, capital is able to determine the rules for all these countries that had been resisting American capitalism in one way or another all through the 20th century. So the main mechanism that is used to pry open these middle and lower class income countries is trade treaties, WTO, the IMF, and specifically, it's part of it is trade treaties like NAFTA, where it's like groups integrating, but mostly it is bilateral trade treaties. This is it. Like it's not one big trade network made up of like a UN of trade. It is individual relationships between the United States government and specific other governments, which, of course, makes sense that that's how it would work if we conceive of global capitalism as this hub and spoke situation, which is what it is. If that's the case, then you're going to everything's going to have to be run through Washington. So all these treaties now are put in place, which they operate by first absorbing in the near term all of the dislocation of creating free trade between the U.S. and a country that's got much lower wage costs by having American employment take the hit, basically, because we could afford to. We had other ways to kind of make it up to people in the short term to make them imagine that, we're not having a tremendous step backward in quality of living. No, we're still in control of our destiny. But they use the political threat of protectionism as a leverage point to kind of get these countries to pry open their markets. they were able to go to these countries and say, look, we love free trade, but if we keep getting hammered on this stuff, if you eventually our voters are going to demand tariffs, or you could open your markets and we could tell our people, hey, now we get to trade there and we get to send our stuff to them. And that really helped grease the wheels, although for the most part, there wasn't a lot of resistance. Like, we talk about how this is an imposition on these foreign countries, and it is. It's certainly an imposition on their people, none of whom would have voted for any of this. None of them wanted it. It was not in their best interest in the near or long term. But their ruling classes were unified in their demand for access to U.S. capital and markets. That was how the people who were already rich, already capital holders in these countries were going to, in this new competitive framework, be able to make money. It's the only way. Because again, the alternative to this is democratic control of the economy, which runs directly counter to their interests. No, demoralize the working class, hyper-exploit them, and then be basically the middleman between U.S. capital and your supply of resources and labor. And since capitalism is pretty much in the driver's seat politically everywhere, these people relatively enthusiastically adopt this new trade regime. And what's embedded in these treaties are legal structures, legal theories that are marginal things in American jurisprudence, aren't even accepted as legal facts in America, but are now inscribed legally in pretty much every governing policy, thanks to it's being written into these treaties. Again, going around democracy, saying, hey, you can't vote to do this. You can't vote to do that to your economy, because private property is transcendent of all other rights, which, again, this is a religious thing based on that religious belief in hierarchy, the need for it, and its expression through property ownership. And one of the main legal theories here that is imposed in these treaties is the notion of regulatory takings. Now, we'd already seen how a big part of globalizing capitalism was making it so that countries would not expropriate foreign investment. They couldn't just say, the government wouldn't just say, hey, that's ours now, that bank's ours now, that mine is ours, because that's going to keep capital from coming in if they think they're going to lose it. So you'd already seen a huge decline in expropriation in the 80s as these countries were sort of disciplined by their need to access the market. But regulatory takings took that even further and said, actually, not only can you not expropriate, the assumption is you can expropriate if you pay like the worth of the item, which is never going to be worth it for anybody to do, because the rate is just set too high because it's set by them. They get to say how much a thing is worth, so that means they'll always set it above what you can pay. So practically you can't expropriate with that rule. But in addition, there's a reading that says any regulation on the economy that you have as a country that might take profits from, not even expropriating their actual capital, it might reduce their profits going forward, also has to be compensated for, because you are taking from their firm through regulation. And this is, like I said, it's a marginal legal theory that had its support in American jurisprudence was shockingly, as you'd imagine, it was big during the Gilded Age. Then it went away. It became a fringe doctrine during during the New Deal and post-war era. And then in the 80s, presto, comes back and becomes imposed everywhere as a legal concept. This is a thing that is only present in American law and is now internationalized without anybody voting for it. And what this means is now you got all these trade networks that are all being regulated with these treaties, and those treaties have to be arbitrated because there will be conflicts. And so the main institutional enforcer of this new regulatory regime is the Bank of International Settlement, which arbitrates on an allegedly impartial basis between states and corporations, basically. And this is classic bourgeois justice, claims to be disinterested, third party, actually made up of US and UK lawyers who are fully enmeshed in the revolving door between finance and government service. And they dominate what is called the arbitration community, all these arbitrators for these institutions who are all essentially working for US capital, and therefore are able to create a corpus of rulings of arbitration that substantially and consistently favors capital against democracy, basically. Now, this newly volatile system still needs some sort of regulatory structure because, yes, we're now accepting that huge crashes are going to happen cyclically and that the government's job is going to be to stop the contagion by dumping in liquidity and nothing else. But if people are going to start speculating wildly, they have to be able to know where their money is going. And so this risk management assessment, risk assessment becomes what stands in for actual regulation. The only real regulation now is that certain securities require a degree of like a price, like assets to price. Basically, they have to have a certain percentage of the money they're lending out in reserve to cover a loss, and they create a sliding scale which grades these instruments according to how much collateral essentially is still in reserve with the institution making it. Or not, it's not collateral. It's a ratio, basically, of money you have to money you're lending out, margin requirement. And the safer they are, the less leverage they are, basically. And that's set at an international level. But then, wouldn't you know it, the international standard is only applied to small domestic banks in emerging economies. The big multinational conglomerate banks essentially get to regulate themselves. They create independent rating agencies that are created, which are funded directly by the big banks. So they are essentially able, a liquidity cap, thank you. They are essentially able to dictate and determine their own rating for their own instruments, which is, of course, we know ended up being disastrous for the housing market in the aughts, because the issuers of the bonds or of the mortgage-backed securities were buying their rating. But the smaller banks, the banks in smaller developing countries, they have to they are disciplined by this actual standard on the international market. This is the two-track justice system that guarantees that capital will win, and they will use the American state to enforce that victory over any social formation anywhere, nation state or otherwise. So the other thing that is needed, though, to pin this whole thing down is a monetary policy that can be depended upon. Because we've talked about how, the government is, the state's role in maintaining capitalism is in determining the money supply. Because that is something that cannot be privatized. Private money is impossible. So it is where it's the nexus point between our fake division between private and public. That's why it's so dicey. And that's why so many reactionaries are fixated on the gold standard, because it removes it pushes back the abstraction. It's like, this is literally beyond our control. Money comes from how much gold we have. We don't make that. Of course, us deciding that gold is what money is the choice. That's what determines the pool. But we get to pretend it's the actual amount of gold that determines it. And there's this right-wing fixation on it because it resolves that contradiction. Liberals, of course, are more happy to wallow in contradiction. And so they're happy to sit there in the nexus, like good Lutherans. between private and public, because they understand that they can't afford the illusion that these things are separate. They just think that it's still natural because they have a deeper transcendent relationship to capital than even sort of the lumpen populist reactionary does. And so what these countries in these new emerging markets that are now connected to hub and spoke style to the U.S. supply chains and money markets is central bank independence. Because we got rid of the gold standard, it's not coming back, but we need an artificial constraint that is not accessible by democracy to determine the money supply. And what that means is a push to demand, as part of all the package of structural adjustment regulations and reformations that go into any creation of a neoliberal economy in these states, they were going to have to promise basically not to print money if things go bad, to have a central bank tasked with the same thing that the central bank that the U.S. Federal Reserve is tasked with, keeping inflation low. And so what is presented and pushed as an attempt to create independent central banks for all this country is, in effect, actually creating a franchise model where all of these central banks are essentially branch offices of the U.S. Federal Reserve, because they will, as policy, as ideology, as theology, follow the dictates of the Federal Reserve. And it is that guarantee that gives the incentive for capital to start flowing to these countries. Like, that was the condition for, many people might know this, but some of you might not, the condition that the Afrikaner government extracted from Mandela and the ANC to abolish apartheid was central bank independence. They needed to assure that if they gave up the reins of democracy, that they would maintain the actual control over the economy. Because if they didn't have that, then there would be an attempt to there would be at least a pressure from below to actually democratize the economy, which could not be allowed to happen. And of course, you can even imagine, squint hard enough and see that action as not just grubby self-interest. Because I guarantee you, those scumbag Afrikaners, you get them drunk enough to be like, look, even if they could do it, it won't matter, because if you try to do it, you'll get crushed. You will be destroyed. Capital will flow out of your country, and you'll never get it back. And you can look at what happened in Zimbabwe in the late 90s, early aughts, for what would have happened in South Africa if they had not accepted its central bank independence. So they could even tell themselves they were doing the right thing, not even just for their faction or for, the white Afrikaners, or the white South Africans. Basically all Afrikaners are white. They can imagine, I'm saving the country from disaster, because if the U.S. is there to fucking punish you, it will. If money can flow out of your economy when you try to socialize economic activity, it will. And there's nothing you can do to get it back. That is why Piketty and others have said the only way that you're going to deal with global inequality or rein in private capital is with international standards, international minimum tax rates. Like global capital controls, basically, to prevent money from just moving around. Because otherwise, every independent nation state, no matter if it's governed by communists or populist reactionaries who are going to fix everything by creating like Herrenvolk democracy, their efforts to socialize the economy will be disciplined out of effectiveness. Same thing happened with Venezuela. And of course, that's what makes it so infuriating when people point to places like Zimbabwe and Venezuela and say, look, this is why socialism doesn't work. And it's like, yes, motherfucker, because it presents as an existential threat to the system, and it initiates a white blood cell attack from outside of it. So this new regime of liberalized economies and capital flows, it has one big obstacle, and that is government corruption. Now, of course, as we know, the reason that the West isn't corrupt is because the actual corruption is just legalized. We have settled, we've tamed the corruption that we used to have in the 19th century. And the thing is that money over time will team corruption, because people will grow up benefiting from a system and therefore have faith in it and desire to see it perpetuated, which they understand is undermined by corruption. Corrupt individuals act because they have no faith the system is going to benefit them, which is why in emerging democracies and in crisis-ridden economies, corruption is endemic, because there's no reason to trust the system at all. So by these guys' own lights, none of these systems would actually give the sort of broad-based, prosperity that they were promising if people were corrupt. But the thing is, the only people who are going to go along with gutting their country's economies and destroying every mechanism for democratic accountability of the economy are going to be motivated by money. What else is going to motivate them? They don't have a religious faith in this shit. They haven't been conditioned in it. In the when the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. had this remit. We're going to create a non-corrupt government that is going to dismantle all public ownership and watch the standard of living of their fellow citizens collapse down a fucking sewer. Who is going to do that out of noble fucking urges? Who is going to do that out of nobility of the heart? Yeah, a few like totally brainwashed Randian ideologues, but most people are only going to do it if it benefits them in the very near term, because they know that they're fucking destroying the fucking foundations of their own social order. They just don't care. And that happened in every fucking country that the struggling and post-communist and post-colonial that had to accept these structural adjustments. The only people agreeing to do it in these countries are fucking crooks. And then, oh no, there's no broad-based prosperity. Of course, you know, neoliberals will talk about reducing poverty in the 20th century, all in China, all in the last 30 years, nowhere else. A little bit, but mostly stagnant, if not declining, everywhere else. Oh, that's because of corruption. We didn't want that. But corrupt officials are the only ones who are going to carry out your policy. So there's this fake charade of imposing anti-corruption measures on these countries. But that's just to get PR to reassure the markets, to pat them on the back and say your money's safe there. But because, you know, corrupt people are, at the end of the day, disciplined by the dollar, disciplined by the deepest pocket, there's no worry that they're going to go against the greater interests of capitalism. And the U.S. actually used anti-corruption as an excuse for why they did not offer a bailout to Russia when they had a economic crisis in the late 90s, along with a bunch of other countries. And we'll talk in the next chapter talks about it, and we'll end talking about Russia and why they were different than all the other big countries, big crisis countries that got hit in the 90s by financial panics. But the stated argument was, you're not doing enough anti-corruption, which is hilarious. The only person who would have done what Yeltsin did, sell his country down the river for global capitalism that he could not have believed in, is because he's a fucking drunk scumbag. Because he is a pirate. That's the only person you're going to get to do that job. Poor Gorbachev, poor pure believer Gorbachev had to go down the chute. He wouldn't have been corrupt, but tough shit. He wouldn't have done it. He got pushed out to the fucking door because he couldn't recognize the moment. You either had to fight that thing or you had to submit to it. And the only ones fighting were the delusional communists who got shelled out of the Duma by Yeltsin in his coup. And everybody that he got on his side, both in the coup and then in the 96 re-election, was bought and paid for by US dollars. And that's why, starting in the late 90s, Russia drifts out of the American orbit, because it's just not working. The benefits aren't accruing to capitalism for its perpetuation in the country. So it becomes a gangster state ruled over by an oligarchy, because those are the only people who give a shit. What is this person doing? Someone's having a stroke in the stream. Can you get rid of that person? Can you delete these? Okay, good. Was that Portuguese? It looked like it was Portuguese, but I don't know. Okay, so chapter 10, New Imperial Challenge, Managing Crisis. As we said, they got out of the regulating game. They got out of the crisis aversion game. Now they're firefighters. Global capital systems, central banks, treasury departments exist to pump in liquidity after a crash, prop back things up, keep the fucking drunk staggering around so that you can keep charging his credit card. Because this is crisis mode capitalism. That's all we have left is crisis, because we've jettisoned any democratic accountability, control, direction, intervention in this thing. So that means it's straight into the side of the wall at 100 miles an hour. So as I said, we have this new paradigm, disaster capitalism for all. The system depends on overheating. Then you have this moment to intervene from the point of view of state policy, liquidity, but then with liquidity comes conditions, further liberalizations, further deregulations, further financialization of the economy, necessary now, if you want to get the money. And of course, what's perverse about this, all the crises I'm talking about now, and all the crises that have been in the 21st century since, we talk about them as bailouts and of these countries, right? Like we're going to talk about the bailout of Mexico in '94, and then the Asian crisis. None of that, but then going into the 21st century, the pigs, none of those bailouts were to the people of those countries. The money did not go into the budgets. The money went to their creditors. The money just went to banks. All they did was reduce what they owed on a ledger. Did nothing to actually stimulate the economy at a demand level, which is why they've languished, and they continue to languish. The Keynesian response, hey, demand side stimulus is now off the table because we have too much, you can print tons of money. The MMTers are right about that. But where it goes is politically determined, and it can only go up. It can only go to the top. It can only go to in the form of liquidity at the top to the finance system. It cannot go everywhere. So in the 90s, that meant that there are 72 crises, significant financial crises, in low and middle income countries, which is just blowing the doors off of any of the decades after World War II. And these were all caused by these busts were all caused by first booms, and those booms came in the form of U.S. Direct private investment to the developed world that went from $170 billion in a year in the late 80s, early 90s to $1.3 trillion a year in the mid 90s, and that was all because after taming inflation in the 80s, interest rates in the U.S. were now much lower, which sent money out of the country looking for better return. And these developing countries, with their new bilateral trade treaties with America, their new regulatory regimes, their new constraints on capital flight or capital control, they're all very appealing places to invest. But because this is, this is not the sort of grassroots demand stimulation that like builds sustained economic activity, it all goes into a series of bubbles. And then those bubbles end up popping when inevitably something puts a kink in the hose of funding. And in the form of, and what happens in Mexico, which is the poster child for structural adjustment in the 80s. They do everything. They're like, thank you, sir, may I have another? And that's because of the PRI. It's because after the Mexican Revolution, this like clientist single-party state emerged that got rid of the fear of dictatorship that had dominated Mexican politics in the 19th century by replacing it with this corporatist model. So this client structure is very happy to get U.S. markets, get U.S. funding, get U.S. investment. And so it does everything it's asked of it, and everybody is just patting its head saying, look at Mexico. And then they sign NAFTA, look at Mexico, they're being so good. But in the 90s, in 94, interest rates go up a little bit, and the money spigot goes the other direction, and the whole thing fucking collapses. And there's a $30 billion hole thrown in the Mexican, into the peso, as the pesos flee the country. And this triggers a Treasury and Fed bailout of Mexico. $30 billion, as I said, which again, not going to Mexicans, going to their banks, the creditors that supposedly are taking a risk that is what justifies their interest. And Mexico, of course, accedes to even more structural adjustment in exchange for this money, which sees significant destruction of the lower classes of Mexican society. A huge move. With NAFTA leads to essentially the annihilation of the agricultural economy in rural Mexico, and takes millions of farmers off the land to find jobs in factories in Mexico or in the or to work in the United States. Of course, this is the context that is always forgotten when talking about immigration. That like this is not just a bunch of people making independent decisions. This is the result of, or their moral, like, oh, they're breaking the law, they're bad people. It is just a tidal flow caused by this massive restructuring of the Mexican state that cut subsidy, cut direct employment, and also brought in highly subsidized American agricultural products to destroy the margins of independent farmers. But growth, economic growth in Mexico, up. NAFTA boosts exports. So it's a success. It worked. The next big crisis is in Asia. So in the early 90s, people are saying, look at Mexico, they're doing great. They also, you see people talking about the Asian tigers. These economies in Asia, vaguely kind of racist thing to say, hey, look at those Asian economies, they're all like tigers. And it's South Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia. And what's happening here is it's a similar relationship to Japan. These countries have a similar economic relationship to Japan as Mexico does to the United States. You've got a similar situation. Low interest rates in Japan, cheap yen. That means easy credit to loan to high margin speculative investments in specifically Thailand, but also to a lesser extent South Korea and Indonesia. But of course, again, creates a bunch of speculative bubbles, including in Thailand, a huge real estate bubble where the army officers who basically run the economy there get in bed with Japanese investors to just build a bunch of housing and hotels and stuff. And then all that has to happen is Japan makes noises about raising their interest rate, and it starts a chain reaction that goes through all through Asia. And the U.S. essentially suborns Japan into playing the same role with Thailand as we played with Mexico. And they didn't want to do it. But we said, no, like, this is how this works. You are our main client here in East Asia, have been since the war. You carry out our remit here, which means you have a role as a node with a role related to these other nodes. So Japan and the IMF, they do a bailout of Thailand, once again, bailing out just giving money to the banks that loaned it to them, and in exchange for structural adjustment. In Indonesia, Suharto, who had been put in power largely by the U.S. in the 60s to stop Indonesia from going communist, killed 1 million people in the process. The success story of the Cold War. Bigger. People talk a lot about Guatemala and Iran. Those were all coups. Those were all coups in more sense than one for the CIA. But Indonesia is their crowning jewel. But live by the sword, die by the sword. Like, he was a U.S. puppet his entire career. That's who he depended on. And when the tide turned, we let him hang out to dry and let him get overthrown. And imposed an IMF structural adjustment that devastated the Indonesian economy. Very similar thing happened with in the Congo, Zaire as it used to be called, with Mobutu, who we put in there to neutralize Lumumba, and who by the 90s had been totally delegitimized. The economic conditions and the war in Rwanda next door fatally destabilized him, and we sent him packing. And of course, when we send these guys packing, Marcos, same thing happened in the 80s. We pat ourselves on the back that, like, yeah, we're getting rid of dictatorship, when we're firing an associate who's not working out. Now, Korea also has a big crisis. What's interesting there is that, even though the Korean working class is as beaten down as any of those in Asia after World War II. Korea was ruled by a right-wing dictatorship during most of the post-war period that only recently, the 80s, gotten democracy, quote unquote, was still able to carry off a huge general strike. Obviously, not the big strike that overthrows the state, but something that certainly rocked people in Korea and seriously spooked potential investors in Korea, who were terrified now that the South Korean government was going to come out of control, especially when a left-wing activist, sort of tangentially associated with the strike, was elected president. And what happens is the same thing we've seen before with Mitterrand. Guy gets in, Syriza, same thing. Gets in, mandated the people to stand up to capitalism, gets the talk, understands the real consequences of going against the demands of the IMF and the U.S. government, what that would mean for their economy, what that would mean for their prospects, their democratic prospects, and they disciplined their working class. They accepted huge job losses. They cut their already threadbare safety net because there was no alternative. Now, the Asian market crisis triggers a big crisis in Russia. And here, the money stops flowing. Here, there is no bailout. Essentially because Russia wouldn't play along with America's demands. Because they didn't have to. Because they actually had independent power in the form of their vast nuclear arsenal. And that meant that Russia defaulted on their debt. And that really is, 98, when you see the breach. Because Russia is brought in as like a corrupt client state with Yeltsin. But then by 98, when Putin's getting in there, the cracks are appearing. And Putin's going to take Russia out of the U.S. orbit because at that point, he and the other people in like positions of power in Russia understood that suborning themselves fully to the dictates of American capitalism would lead to the same sort of subservient status that all these other countries had. And they didn't have to accept it. They had an alternative. With all their gas and oil and their fucking missiles, they could take their own path. And they have been ever since, and we have been punishing them ever since. We've been expanding NATO like crazy. We did brinksmanship. We got the war we wanted. in Ukraine, we're hoping in the long term to finish the job of buck-breaking Russia. And they're resisting. But of course, there's people who want to make them into heroes for that. But it is just this sclerotic, corrupt national bourgeois trying to maintain their power, their narrow control. It is not any kind of resistance to regimes of domination. It is simply a decentralized one that they want to maintain control over rather than be turned into total handmaidens of Washington. So there's two sides to this new quote-unquote regulatory regime. And it's these bailouts, this guarantee that if the ship hits the fan, there will be a spigot of money to keep liquidity going. But that has to be matched with a new legal regime that accelerates speculation and encourages monopoly capital formation. Because again, growth now is determined by speculation. If you do not have maximum accelerating speculation, you don't have an economy. You don't have capital circulation. And of course, that's incredibly destabilizing, which is why the bailouts are there. So everybody can keep playing the game and not have to worry that they're going to go off a cliff, because the daddy Fed will be there to protect them in their everlasting arms. And part of that means the final end to Glass-Steagall, any sort of partition between commercial banking and investment banking. Everybody gets to invest. Everybody gets to have their securities. Everybody gets to have derivatives. It's a derivative revolution, they call it. You get a derivative, you get a derivative, you get a derivative. The more derivatives we make, the more we can circulate the capital, the more we can compensate for the decline in actual productivity of the economy, the real one that this is all supposed to be based on. And part of this derivatives revolution is this amazing third-way Clinton triangulation that you got to actually admire for how elegant it is. So Clinton has, this remit with African Americans and minorities as part of the Democratic coalition. They do have an interest, a actual narrow political interest in seeing them advanced so that they'll vote for them. And that means making home ownership accessible to people who were denied a chance to get in on the lottery of the GI Bill and the post-war cheap financing, direct financing. Now, there's no more GI Bill. There's none of that. That's all an extinct political economy. But what we can do is financialize mortgages to facilitate lending. If you allow the creation of these mortgage securities, you minimize the risk of lending money to any specific person, which means people who systemically and structurally have less wealth because they were denied access to wealth can now have access to credit. And for people who already have a home, they find that thanks to the mortgage interest rate deduction that allows you to deduct the interest you pay on your mortgage, not the actual mortgage, but the interest from your taxes, it allows you to borrow money against your home's equity at a lower rate than is posted, basically. A special subsidized cheap rate. And then that stimulates consumer spending, and compensates for the lack of wage increases. Because remember, wages stopped rising in 1980, basically. But people have to spend more over time. And so cheap credit for mortgages, subsidized by the tax code, allows for access to the credit that will allow people to do that spending. And of course, because they're borrowing it, it means that they are not free, that they're digging their own fucking grave. They're paying for their own prison. But there is no alternative. If you can only express yourself, if you can only express your identity and your spiritual self-conception through consumption, then you have to consume. And honestly, the most horrifying thing in this chapter, and this is really this is a Lovecraftian realization. So they talk at the end of this chapter about Brooksley Born. Anybody who watched any of the Frontline shows about the crash in 2008, I think she was in one of the Alex Gibney movies too. She was the Cassandra, who was in the Clinton administration, the regulator who was saying, like, if we stop regulating this stuff, it will blow up. She was telling everybody that. And Larry Summers and those guys, they all patted her head and told her to go away. And, it was sexism played a role, of course, and they were all bought and paid for Wall Street stooges. But once again, just like with the Afrikaners negotiating the end of apartheid, they had a story to tell themselves that made getting rid of regulation, even knowing that it's going to cause a crisis, as the smart and only and correct and adult move. Because this new economic paradigm, this financialized economy, requires maximum flow, which means the lightest amount of friction in transactions. Because again, we were talking about it, that's the only way to keep the acceleration of capital, is to have people trading things, slicing things into smaller tranches and then selling them to each other more and more times. And every regulation, every intervention slows down those transactions. So if you were to actually enforce a regulatory oversight to prevent a crash, you will cause one. It's better to lean back and let it come naturally. Again, this appeal to a fantasy notion of a true natural market that reveals the invisible hand of God. That's the invisible hand of the market. Whose hand is that? It's God's. And this is where, once again, we get to the theological basis for this stuff. These are all theologies. And it's like, that's why it's banal to even say it. To say something is a theology. Of course it is. All of this is an extension and a materialization of theology. The question is, which theology are we going to fucking live by? The one where our separation is eternal and existential? The one where we are hostage to an idiot, psychotic God? Or the one where we are fundamentally connected and through connection can come to mutual understanding, sufficient to direct our actions? And I think the evidence is we do have that capacity. But that capacity obviates the necessity for class rule in a way that our rulers will simply not allow to happen. I really do think that you need hell. Hell exists as a concept to justify class rule. The notion that some are damned and some are saved, and that there is some eternal place of torment or reward, that raises the stakes, right, of life so dramatically that it necessitates structures to enforce codes of behavior and ideas. Because if you don't, you will lose people. But what if there's nothing to lose? Not that there is no heaven, not that there is no hell, but that we are all saved by virtue of being human. If that's true, then we can make mistakes. And we don't have to rely on alienated institutions to enforce orthodoxy of any kind. But again, that has to come from outside. No system is going to come to the realization. All those good Keynesians in the 60s and 70s, they didn't say, oh, I guess we have to go to war with capitalism now. We thought we could have reform, but it turns out we have to go to war. No. They submitted because they wanted to think they were good people. They wanted to think they were moral and were trying to lead people towards some sort of post-scarcity promised land. But that was all a delusion. That was all self-talk. They were the handmaidens of capitalism the entire time. And of course, the irony is that this insistence on, patrolling hell, creating a system that, separates the saved from the damned, and rewards the saved and punishes the damned, which is what we imagine we're creating with our economic systems, whether we're liberals or Democrats. Oh, what's actually happening? You're literally turning Earth into hell. Earth is turning into I hate to use the word, but God damn it, it's one of the best terms coined in the 21st century, a geo-hell. And anyone, honestly, who cares if the book is gibberish? If anyone knows about geo-hell. The book is gibberish. Who cares? Book schmuck. Being able to encapsulate a concept that pithily that's a real achievement, and I salute. But yeah, we're turning Earth into hell in our pursuit of heaven. What a joke. What a cosmic joke. And a cosmic shame. That's a cosmic shame. That's a cosmic shame. That's a cosmic shame. Folks, cosmic shame, isn't it? I should rename this that. Never mind. All right. See you guys. So next week, don't know what date yet, but next week we'll do part 11. Or no, I'm sorry, part 6. Part 6, the global capitalist millennium. Yeah, that's right. Welcome to the millennium, the 21st century, where it gets real hairy, real quick, and where every fairy tale these people told themselves throughout the 90s gets woken up from, and then new and even more fantastical vehicles for delusion are forged. Bye-bye.